Okay, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Loris Wanzarek. I'm Interim Executive Director at Downtown On the Go. We are the nonprofit advocate and resource for all things transportation in the greater Tacoma area. We're very excited to be able to offer these forums in a hybrid format. Huge thank you to the Office of Events and Conferences at UW Tacoma for allowing us to use this space. For our 2025 Friday Forum series, we are exploring how Tacoma, both the city and its residents, is changing through discussions on new and upcoming policy, the impacts of rising housing costs and displacement, and the future of transit in the South Sound. Today, we'll be discussing new and upcoming policy and what it means for Tacomans. There will be a Q&A section at the end of the forum. For folks in the room, you should have gotten a piece of paper. I'll collect those towards the end, or you can bring them up to me. If you are on the webinar, then you can use the Q&A function. At any time, you can put those questions into the Q&A. Now, I want to introduce our moderator, Tanisha Jumper. Tanisha is the Chief Communications Officer for Tacoma Public Schools. Go ahead.
Hello, good to see you. I was talking to Christina Walker, who used to be the executive director here, and I think this is my 10th year as moderator for Friday Forums, which is super exciting. So glad to be with you all. I'm excited today because I get to talk to my friends. So I have worked with everyone on this panel at some point, and that is really awesome. Makes for a great conversation. I do just want to bring into the room, there's a lot happening at the federal level, and more than any one of us could keep up with. That would be an entire full-time job to keep up with the way things are changing, which policies are impacting what things. And so I just want to kind of level set that we're going to try our very best to have a meaningful conversation without too much conjecture about what's happening at the federal level or how that might affect the plans we have right here. We live in a state that has a lot of protections that protect us from some of the things that are happening at a federal level, but also things are moving in ways that have not been, we don't have a history with. So really, if we can focus on like what's happening here locally, what the plannings are that are local, and knowing how to, and thinking about how we move those things in spite of, in conjunction with, I don't know, however you think about that, but really not wanting that to occupy too much of the space. Otherwise, we wouldn't really be able to talk about anything because we don't know what's going to happen on, I don't even know what day it is this week. That's how crazy it's been the last 2 weeks. So I just wanted to put that into the room because I know there are a lot of people looking for like some definitive, this is how we're going to move forward. And I don't know that we have that. And so just, it's woefully unsatisfying for some of us who are strategic planners and like to know what's happening 5 years from now. But also it's the reality of where we're at. So with that, I'm going to let my panel introduce themselves. So Lauren, would you like to?
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. And to Tanisha's point, yes, it's really a pleasure to be on a panel with close friends and people that I've batted around concepts with for 10 years. So it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Lauren Flemister, and I'm the Assistant Director of Planning and Public Works for Pierce County. And I'm excited to talk about things like our comprehensive plan and sustainability efforts and a variety of other ideas and policies today.
Good morning, Korbett Mosley. It is also a pleasure to be here and on this topic today and in this room in an amazing space. So really thankful for the, it's a cool space to be in and having this conversation with a good group. And I don't know how many people we have online, but this is, I was looking forward to this conversation wherever it goes. My name is Korbett Mosley. I'm Managing Director of the Community Reinvestment Project at Department of Commerce that's overseeing a $200 million investment to respond to communities that were harmed by the war on drugs. We've obligated out and put out contracts over $197 million. A lot of those dollars are just now hitting Tacoma, Pierce County, and communities across the state with a focus on 6 counties King, Pierce, Snohomish, Clark, Yakima, Spokane. I think that's it. Yeah, the 6. And so we've learned a lot. So I really hope to engage, with this group today around the equity work that we've been doing, and also responded to the harm that government has caused, and some different strategies that we've learned in terms of advancing equitable economic development in a number of different programs. And so really excited to be here today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Karnes. I serve on the Planning Commission for the City of Tacoma, and have been chair for the last several years on that commission, that volunteer commission. I guess what I bring to the table is some of the experience regarding the development of home in Tacoma in terms of expanding options for housing, especially housing near transportation options, in order to try to reduce household expenditures for transportation and housing, so that we can meet the needs for all people of all income groups. For that purpose. So I'm happy to be a part of this group today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, so we're gonna start. It's kind of cool to be up here, and so Lauren and I, and a wonderful consultant, and one other former employee of City of Tacoma, were kind of the architects of the AHOS Affordable Housing Action Strategy. So it's very cool to hear Chris talk about home in Tacoma, because that kind of was birthed out of that strategy. And I think I saw Ted somewhere in the room, who is now currently one of the people working on that strategy. So it's a very full circle moment, especially as I get ready to celebrate my 10 years of being back in Tacoma. When we're talking about, Chris, I'm gonna start with you, since you got to talk last. What are some of the recent learnings from policy that you've been involved in, things that you learned from maybe home in Tacoma? What I know there's a lot of public feedback, a lot of conversations about what the impacts of that. So what were some of the learnings from that?
Well, I think what we learned is that that there's a great deal of need over the next 20 years for the development of new housing. So we need another, I want to say, 45,000 housing units constructed in the next 20 years, that's a huge mountain to climb. And what we were able to achieve, I think, with Home in Tacoma was to identify how we are going to meet each one of those income brackets from 0 to 30%. So people of very low incomes. Also from the perspective of ownership housing, new ownership housing, bringing that online for incomes between 80% and above. But we do have a gap. I think that one thing that we did learn is that we do have a significant gap between sort of 30 and 80% of exactly how are we going to support that, because we've gone through the process of identifying where we could locate this housing, and we've made the changes to legalize that. But now it's a question of rallying the resources necessary to construct that housing over that time period.
To Lauren, and from the county, I mean, a lot of what we learned in the beginning of the kind of the Affordable Housing Action Strategy was that these jurisdictions had to work together, that this wasn't just affecting Tacoma. While it might be more pronounced in Tacoma, it was affecting the rest of the county. And if we didn't have codes and things in the other parts of the county that supported this work, there were going to be areas of the community that were just nope, we're not doing affordable housing, we're good over here, which was then going to force more pressure onto other parts like Tacoma, and Tacoma's at capacity with what they have to project just for Tacoma. So from a county perspective, what are some of the learnings and things that you guys have been working on to support work like Home in Tacoma?
So I think I'm going to touch on two things. And I think the very first thing I would say is there's a very big difference between sort of the regulatory and policy environment and what the market actually does. And it makes me laugh because, people get really worked up about zoning. And I often think, and I hope this isn't morbid, but you're probably going to be dead by the time your community changes. Because it takes so long for, not always, but it typically takes a couple of decades from the time we rezone things to material changes throughout a community, particularly in a community like Tacoma that is not a boom town. I think we've seen, the economic environment has never taken that gigantic step that people always hope that it will. And although prices are bananas, they still haven't appreciated at the levels that we're seeing, in Seattle and north of Seattle, all the way up to Bellingham, right? So I think figuring out how to incentivize and encourage the kinds of development like home in Tacoma, that missing middle housing, that smaller scale housing, away from sort of the sprawled single family development that we often see, say, in Pierce County, and figuring out a way to get more dense development in our cities and towns, and maybe seeing some opportunities for development in unincorporated areas, but not maybe seeing the density of development that we're seeing in unincorporated. That puts a tremendous amount of pressure on infrastructure. It puts a tremendous strain on the transit system, and it obviously has negative externalities around the environment and, frankly, social cohesion. It's hard to be in community with people when you're in your car for 35 or 40 minutes a day, and all the things you do are smattered throughout a community versus being co-located or close together. So that's a huge issue, and I think there's a real gap in government around a deep understanding of how markets perform. How do we incentivize businesses like the development community to start putting online the things we want, let alone the challenges of actually getting housing that's actually for folks who are income constrained, because realistically, we're not even getting market rate infill housing at the density and volume we need to support the people we have in this community. That's number one. And number two is very similar, and this is something that Tanisha and I have talked about so many times. Housing is a continuum, and everything that's happening on that continuum affects other things on the continuum, from homelessness all the way to multi-million-dollar projects. I talk about this all the time. I had a professor, so this was when I was still in graduate school for urban planning. I had a professor that said, we all need affordable housing. I need affordable housing. And I thought, what is this lady talking about? What do you mean you need affordable housing? But the fact is, when you don't have housing for people at every income level, they start cannibalizing at the wrong parts of the market, and it creates disruptions for everybody in a community. And we need to help people to understand that that is a reality, that when things happen like, SROs are regulated out of existence.
What are SROs?
So they're basically, those buildings that have a shared kitchen and shared bathrooms, but you have your own room. Those are SROs. Those got regulated out of existence in this region. And I believe it's like single room occupancy is what the SRO stands for. But when you start like outlawing things like that, or rents go up, people who don't have social networks in place, who may have drinking or drug problems. So we're not saying that every single one of these people is like the perfect person, but all those people used to be able to cobble together odd jobs or borrow money from a friend and make rent. When rent costs $1,800, nobody can do that. Nobody can cobble together a situation to make rent. And now all of a sudden, we have all these problems up to 80% and up, because it's just really hard to be able to do that when the market's not producing all the way through. So those are kind of two of the things that are deeply frustrating and really hard to be in government, because we don't control all those things, right? But we keep working on it.
Yeah. So Corbett, thinking about that, like what are some of the things that you have learned from working with this population that was deeply affected by, I mean, obviously people who, the war on drugs, there were people that were doing that out of necessity to cobble together the $400 or $500 a month it was for rent. Now that's $1,800 that again, and then they were impacted by then the incarceration system, the justice system that then, piled on top of that, and then you can't grant if you have all the things
All
that
of the
come,
things,
right?
right.
So what have you learned from working with organizations and individuals in that set that maybe we need to know as we think about the policies for the future?
Yeah, and so there are a couple of really key things, and some I'm gonna highlight that were legislative in intent or direction because that's important to point back to that. Some of the things that we did were programmatic decisions. And I think it's important to know the difference of like where we have legislature directing a particular thing as opposed to what we have a decision-making authority as an agency for Department of Commerce or any other agency. But then there's also programmatic decisions. And I do think it's important to kind of like point to a couple of things that gave us some protection for me to do some of the work that we were able to do across the state. One of the things that was in the RCW for the Community Reinvestment Project was a phrase that said that these resources must be distributed in collaboration with by and for organizations as defined by the Office of Equity and Department of Commerce. And that phrase in there, by and for definitions and collaboration, we were able to define what that looks like. At the community level, legislature said, hey, we want to do this investment to respond to communities harmed. We won't go in, it's an hour just to talk about the short version of how communities were impacted. But said before you spend any of this money, you have to go out to community that was most impacted and come up with a plan with how the resources would be distributed. So that was one thing. And in that community plan, we identified not just individual harm, but community harm. And so that's a distinction I think that was helpful in terms of communities that were harmed by the war on drugs, because it wasn't just the individual that had a drug record or something, drug possession. We actually had veterans in Washington state deported because of a small drug charge for marijuana. I mean, there was, so not only that, Black, Latinx, and tribal communities across the state, there is an abundance of data, an abundance of information, not just individuals that were harmed, but communities were harmed. So we targeted resources to those communities that were most harmed. And that language, going back to that phrase about by and for, we targeted the partnerships and the resources with by and for organizations that represent those groups. And why is that important? It's important for a lot of reasons, one of which we can prevent paternalism. And paternalism is like you have a predominantly white-led organization that says, yes, we can serve Hispanics. We can serve that community. And look, we already do. It's a very different thing to balance power and power dynamics of contracting with a by and for organization that is led by and for the community that it serves. It's its purpose. It's the reason it exists, and it's made up of that community. And so you're able to get more culturally responsive programs. You're able to get more context around data. You're able to get more relationships on the uptake in terms of the programs. So out of the $197 million that we contracted out, there was always a preference, and the data shows, so there's some contracts we were able to do 100% by and for organizations. Some contracts we got 56% by and for organizations. And that leveraging and balancing of power, our shifting power dynamics in terms of who we're contracting with, I think makes a big difference in how we can approach the work. I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons that we have, that we've learned. The other thing is, let me make sure I don't, you'll stop me, okay. The other thing that we learned was around braided funding. And so I'll share that so we have, let's say we have a portfolio, I have 28 organizations across the state that are doing financial coaching. Well, now we have the other release of grant programs that assist with home ownership, or assist with other capital grants, or business loans, or those kinds of things. We're making sure that these providers are connected to this group of providers. And I know some people, I think that that's happening across the state with the different programs. It is not. It is a very siloed grant management process where you put out the RFP, that's the body of work, that's what folks are sticking to, but not necessarily combining, and not just to bring providers together in a room, strategically bringing resources together that are naturally can be leveraged with each other. So we're seeing more partnerships across the state. I should say, just for context, that the CRP, I talked about $200 million. It's 17 different grant programs across 4 state agencies, and resulting in over 400 contracts, with the majority of those contracts being by and for organizations, and the majority of, and a good portion of them, small, grassroots, faith-based organizations that have never contracted with the state before. And so we had a lot of new folks that had, it was their first time having a statewide vendor license, or those kinds of things. That magnitude of coordination and dropping this $200 million in a particular to address equity issues in a number of different ways, I think is also showing that we have some work to do in terms of coordination and integration of resources. There were 4 categories, I know 17 programs, there's 4 categories of programs. There's reentry, violence prevention, legal assistance, and the largest pot was economic development. So out of the 200 million, 138 million was for economic development strategies. And the things that I'm really proud of to see connected to housing is an emergence of groups of Black developers that are coordinating and expanding that base in terms of, and what I learned from them is that, and I know this is a world that y'all understand really, but when access to capital and controlling the contract at the beginning of the process is a way that you get more equitable results in the downstream. So if you have Black developers, you're probably going to be more likely to have some Black contractors. If you have more, so there's an ecosystem and some economy that's happening at scale when we're able to do that. And the hardest dollar for a Black developer, or for any developer to get in, is the pre-site construction dollar. And so we've invested and seen investments around the pre-site construction dollar that is helping to kind of spark up so that they can be ready for the loan that they need from the bank to basically to finance the deal. We're also learning that folks that have been doing this for 30, 40 years are in good mentorship opportunities for other new developers that are learning. So it sounds like they're trying to walk this out as more of an apprenticeship opportunity and learn from there. So I'll pause, but those are some big highlights for me.
Is no matter, I think, keeping in mind what Lauren said about the entire continuum, that's how all of our community works. Like the more that everyone can be, have access to good employment, the more that everyone can have access to education, the more thriving and more resources there are for everybody in the community. And sometimes we get very narrow-sighted on very specific populations, not thinking about how homelessness, how does that affect everyone? And I think our lack of willingness to go and ask people. When we first started, the Affordable Housing Action Strategy actually came out of Mayor Strickland's effort around addressing homelessness. And Lauren and I were put on a committee to try to figure out, once people were, the effects of homelessness were kind of mitigated and people were put into a safe space, how do we transition them into housing? Well, what me and Lauren found out very quickly was there was no place to transition them to. So we started trying to figure out, could we buy homes? Could we get, tiny homes? We kind of ran the gambit, and we were like, we have a serious problem that we need to create an environment where we are getting more developers to want to develop them. But one of the things that I did before the committee started is I took my team and we actually went out to it was called the compound. That's what they had named themselves, on Puyallup River. And we walked around and I asked people what how did you get here? And people were like, I was married, my husband got sick, he died, I couldn't afford my rent. I tried to rob Peter to pay Paul, and at some point it caught up to me. There's a lady living in a tent down on the compound with like dresser drawers and a kitchen table in this huge, very expensive tent, but it was what she had left of her past life. Her children didn't even know she was living there because she didn't want to worry them. Like, and then when you talk to people, and some of the other people that were, maybe not as, came from the same life as her, they're saying things like, it's too much. I have to work, then I have to pay for my medicine, then I have to pay for my rent, then I have to pay for all the bills and the things that go in the house, and it's too much. I just want to pay one payment. I just want to know that I only need to come up with $1,000 and all the things are taken care of. So when you think about what Lauren said about like taking out these like SROs and you taking out these other ways of, housing, you're limiting the number of people who can manage all the things you have to manage on a day-to-day basis. And like, don't add kids and spouses and jobs and I mean, like, there's just so much other stuff that like we're consumed by that and that information. Yeah.
This is I think I've asked this question before, but to my knowledge, I don't think is there any current plan or product for a unit to build a unit at below 80% of AMI that doesn't require a subsidy?
Chris?
That doesn't require a subsidy. I mean, we don't see it. I don't know that I don't believe that anybody would choose to do that. I mean, of course, there are for-profit affordable housing developers, and of course, we have, different agencies and nonprofits that put that forward. But I mean, I'm a big fan of like facing reality and meeting people at sort of their basic human instincts. Why would anybody choose to build something and make little to no profit when they can build a bajillion other products and make a ton of money? People just are not going to make that choice. And it's really interesting. You're talking about Black developers. Then we're basically putting the onus on Black developers and developers of color and people just starting out in the development community to make no money. Of course we shouldn't do that, but that's exactly the point. That's where the pressure goes, because we already know everybody else who's established in the development community has made it crystal clear they're not building those products. So then we're putting the onus on people who are just starting out in communities of color and underrepresented people to build those products and make no money doing it, right? And so what is the formula and what are the incentives that we need to put out there in order to make this math, right? Because it just doesn't. It doesn't at all. And to Tanisha's point about those sort of like the SRO products and all those other things, kind of us sitting here representing government, all of us do in some way, either in a volunteer capacity or in our day jobs. What we can do is, number one, get our knowledge up on market, and number two, figure out what we can do from a regulatory and incentive standpoint to help make the environment better. Because there are things we can do. I mean, it's not going to fix the problem, but it can incrementally make it better. And I think, again, a big part of the problem is our knowledge base around the economics of developing housing is poor, and it's been bad every jurisdiction I've ever worked at, including City of Seattle, which has tremendous resources, down to City of Auburn where I worked. It was bad at Tacoma. It's not great at Pierce County for lots of reasons, but I think that's a big issue. It's a big gap.
Yeah. Chris, go ahead.
So it's actually a really good point that Lauren brings up. That so we did actually do some economic analysis about for home in Tacoma. There was a consultant that broke the city down essentially down into three sort of market areas: high, medium, and low, and identified that developers they'll go for essentially the products that will give the greatest amount of return, but there are essentially housing types that we did build into Home in Tacoma that can meet that 60% AMI target. It's just that the return is pretty much zero. So you could construct, but it would essentially have to be a nonprofit housing developer that would have to be able to go out and construct that housing. And so if you're trying to operate a for-profit business, again, the math doesn't math.
I mean, I think that's where we're at in a lot of places. It's like, we want to be more environmentally, sound in our decision making, but going away from plastic bags and trying to get plastics out of your house is an extremely expensive, thing. And it takes a level of commitment and a level of focus that a lot of people were like, I did it for a couple weeks and then it got too hard and they make different decisions, right? Like there's a lot of places in our society right now where the cost of changing, right? Like again, over the 10 years that I've been doing this, there have been these really intense conversations about parking and, well, we want to go from a less car-centric community. Well, what does that mean for people who have a car and that's how they get around and we don't have a transportation system that's quite caught up with that. Like we're just in this very interesting middle zone between who we've always been and where we want to go. And I think we're waiting for some magical person to like write the policy or this like magic government fairy to like come up with a plan that's going to fix it. And I think that's just not how that's going to happen. A lot of these big jumps in kind of human existence have happened out of necessity. There has been a thing that happened that required us to completely rethink how we are. And maybe we're there. I don't know. I'm not quite sure.
And I think sometimes we really need to be, we need to do things at scale for the scale of the problem, or at least like know the different chunks. The pilot programs are great, but we got to get to, and I don't, the whole, even the miss and middle kind of like piece, I was trying to kind of do this math. And so, Lauren and Tanisha, y'all are experts on this, but I'm just throwing out an idea because ideation is one of my things, right? So,
Yes,
what we know that it costs about $400,000 to build a unit with a public from the public housing, right? It costs about $400,000 to build a unit. I know that there were grant programs, and we put this in the CRP, and it's interesting to see what communities actually took this up, because I think that they're doing this in Seattle with CRP dollars. I'd hope that we would have someone in Pierce County do this, but offering $50,000 grants to homeowners to build a DADU or ADU on their property to spur the market on the private side, which I think is a good buy and a good investment. If you have, you can put out a couple hundred products. 50,000 might be enough for a homeowner to go ahead and seal that deal for $200,000 in construction costs, because they're going to be adding value to their property and those kinds of things. And if they rent it out, I personally have always been like, I don't think it matters if they rent it out to their mother-in-law, to their kids off in college, or rent it. I don't think it matters who's in those units as long as we're building. And so when I think about the scale of what you can pilot, with like $4 or $5 million, you could probably spark a whole, maybe don't do that much, but I mean, for the city of Tacoma, I think we could probably handle something like that and get off. You'd have a program costs, you'd have costs to kind of get, maybe it's some pre-site construction, but those kinds of investments to really like unleash where we do have some authority and some existing policy on the books that could be used, that can kind of keep getting better to build up that middle housing. And then I think you get a lot more bang. You can get a lot of bang for the buck in that way. That's my opinion, but let the experts.
I'm going to add one thing quickly, because I know that you probably want to pivot, but this is a very interesting thing. And anytime I have an opportunity to talk about ADUs, I love to, because it's been sort of a thing that councils love everywhere because it's no cost to them. And it sounds awesome, and it is. But I think there's a few things. Number one, the scale of this problem is a private and public sector problem. So I would never say that is an entirely government responsibility. It is not. But I'm weary of the fact that that's a lot of the legislation that elected officials have sort of hung their hat on, and it's just simply not sufficient. That's one. And number two, I would say, what has frustrated me everywhere I've seen ADU legislation is there's never any access to capital component of the program. It literally means I would rather just set it on fire at that point. Where's the money? Like, you're not getting ADUs in any community that is losing their social cohesion, where you need folks to age in place, where you have gigantic infrastructure projects or changes in the market that are causing gentrification. None of those communities can afford to build ADUs. So I do agree with you, though. Any housing that comes online is a win. But what I saw when I ran the program, the pilot program at City of Tacoma, is I saw some really nice ADUs, but those things were probably like $400,000, and they were in the home, like in the backyards of people who had a tremendous amount of money and were probably in at least $1 million homes. Fantastic. I'm totally for it. But I think to address the issue that we need to address, that we need money attached to that legislative effort. We need regulatory changes. We need ready-made plans available, anything to make it extremely easy and affordable for people to do, or else it's just not really worthwhile.
A little bit more to that discussion. So one part of Home in Tacoma that we did integrate was a per unit density bonus that you could. There's a fee in lieu option, which we expect to have happen sort of in the areas of North Tacoma where the market's high. So, and developers may opt to pay $60,000 or so per unit to add that additional unit in that location, but not necessarily make it an affordable unit. But that money would then go into the City of Tacoma's Housing Trust Fund, which could be used. Which honestly, I think there is a lot of. It's kind of an open field for in terms of understanding exactly what are we going to be using that Housing Trust Fund money for, and so I think it's a really good point where we're at right now to be able to have that discussion.
Yeah, again, I think that it's an interesting kind of conundrum of like, you need these things, but you also have, like, I know at one point, I work for the school district, so one of the properties that we surplused, there was a developer, he wanted to like put like 600 units, but then once you go through the process, the infrastructure in that area can't handle 600 units. And then someone has to pay to upgrade all the infrastructure in terms of water, electric, all that to be able to support that type of building. And then everybody's just, looking at each other like, well, who's going to do that part? Like, because that is some of the most, like when we were first starting and talking to developers and the people who make building happen, they were like, yeah, I could build the building, but if I have to do the curb cut and the ADA ramp and the this and then that and the this, I'm out. And the city's like, well, we need more tax revenue to be able to do those things that we can't. And so here's how that all has to work. So there's just this, I don't have an answer. And I would be able to house some people and build an ADU if I had an answer, because I'd be wealthy and I'm not. But I think like that idea of, I just think we have to examine the idea of if these things can happen in the way we want them to happen without the government having the money to be able to do it. I think that's the question.
I know, it's a face-off. You want to duel? Like, I'm first. No, really, I'm first. I'll just say something really quickly. It kind of goes back to the SRO thing. There was a sense that it wasn't dignified, but it's not dignified like living on the street. There's trade-offs that have to be made. And this is where the regulatory piece comes in. And I think I'm a recent convert to this. We have to decide what matters and just start making decisions. Like, do we want to build light rail or do we want to do 8 years of environmental review. What for? Build the freaking light rail. You know what I mean? Like, it just can't be this. Like, it can't be, we have to do everything perfect and good and ask everybody every question in the world and spend 20 years, and then we have nothing and everything now costs 4 times as much as it did when you started. To your point about the development and the curb cuts and the sidewalks, maybe they're just not that important. Maybe we hit life safety. We want to make sure there's some accessibility. So maybe there's accessibility to some units and all the rest of the units aren't accessible. Like, we have to start making smart decisions to get stuff online at a cost we can afford to do it. We cannot do everything. We just can't. We can't afford to. Everything costs so much money. Everything takes so long. And I'm a huge fan of regulation, and I'm a huge fan of communities not bearing the brunt of things that we've done historically. So like from an environmental justice standpoint and all those things. So we need to prioritize those key things, figure out who is going to share the burden, who hasn't historically shared the burden, and start getting things done.
100%.
It's going to be, regarding the DADUs and ADUs. So Seattle, the Central District Collaborative, they're doing a grant program for homeowners in the Central District targeting, and they're a buy and for organization. And so it's interesting where you can get to, where you can get to the eligibility. Like, how do you do that in targeting the right communities, either by geography, by particular, like there could be some thoughts in terms of how you get there. But I remember there was an interesting, and maybe this is too wonky, but there was, when we were looking at data, Black and Hispanic families had the biggest gap between the family size and the number of bedrooms that they had in their unit. They had the biggest gap. They didn't have enough rooms
Right.
for family members. And for most households, for communities, I think most people that have a bedroom got somebody in it. And so what it seems like to me, and I don't know if we could fact check this, but are we continuing to build more individual 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units? And so the other kind of like aspect of this is personally, if I had my basement done or had a DADU, maybe my son and his family would stay a little bit longer and not pay $2,000 themselves.
Right.
Right. And so in terms of family economics and being able to leverage each other and having mother-in-law units and having more multi-generational units and having those come back online, we need some strategy to get there that doesn't, because we know that it's unlikely we're going to build more 4-bedroom units using the public dollar.
Yeah, no, I think it's a real thing. We've talked a lot here about aging in place and what happens when people are forced to move way far out as they get older. They need a smaller house, but what they can afford is out, Puyallup and far. It keeps getting farther and farther, and then they're removed from their social networks, where their doctor is, where they pick medicine up. All of those things impact the quality of life. And if you've ever heard Dr. Ali Medeiros talk about it, he says what science says is women, older people live a more vibrant life if they are in the same spaces as young people, as young families, that like the ecosystem of togetherness preserves life for everybody who's in that ecosystem. And so thinking about that too, of like, it shouldn't be that you have to stay in. I mean, I'm one of those people, Korbett, so I have more rooms than I need because I live in the house I grew up in. And so my kids have all left and I'm in that house by myself, and there's 3 bedrooms that no one is in right now. But I also don't have the luxury to easily give up that house and find something that's comparable or something that's smaller but still as nice closer in. And so there's definitely nothing else in Stillicum for me to move into. Everything else in Stillicum is going to be, $1.5 million, and I don't have that. So I just think it's a very interesting thing that, like, I hate when people say, oh, the problem is the way to solve the problem is to think about it more. But I do think, to Lauren's point, that we do have to get to, we just need to do some stuff and stop being so worried about making the wrong move, because we've made tons of those and we're still here. So we might as well just go ahead and make lots more wrong moves and it'll be fine. Okay. It is time for questions, and I know we have a lot of them. So if you have questions, please fill out your card and Laurel come pick it up. And we're gonna hop right into these. Okay. How does incorporation versus unincorporation impact sustainability? Lauren, I'm gonna.
Hey, thanks for the question. So I'll answer it more broadly. I would say one thing about incorporated, so cities and towns, is they tend to be, they tend to have a more urban development pattern. So more densely populated. So if you're talking more apartment buildings, smaller lots. I think something we didn't touch on that I think is really important is how much larger homes are now than they used to be, like in the 50s, 60s, or before, that being a real issue. So you see much more compact development, and then you also see more supportive systems that offer options that are more environmentally conscious. So you're going to see more transit, more walkable neighborhoods, things like that. When you have unincorporated areas, you have incredible diversity of land types and uses, but you tend to see things be farther apart, less dense development. And something I think that's not talked about very often is economic sustainability, which ties into environmental sustainability, and also just the choices you're able to make. Counties, by design, are large, because they are the holders, the containers for cities and towns. The cost to deliver not only transit, but sewer infrastructure, road infrastructure, surface water management infrastructure is incredibly high the more sprawled it is. And that also means for the infrastructure you have, it tends to be less amenity rich. So when we're thinking about multimodal paths, so thinking about things like bike lanes, trails, places for people to walk. When you have the amount of lane miles that you have in a county, you've now put people on the county that expect things, and now you're trying to deliver those amenities that they could reasonably expect in cities and towns, but becomes a very hard proposition out in counties. Those costs go up. And I don't know how many people have read or listened to anything from Strong Towns. Not sure about the politics, but they do bring up a good point, which is that the infrastructure costs are going to catch up to jurisdictions that aren't being smart about those infrastructure investments, not only to build, but to maintain over time that amount of infrastructure. The bill is going to come due, and I don't think anybody's going to want to pay it when it comes, right?
Yeah. Yep. So Chris, you mentioned the affordable housing and like the gap between 30 to 80 AMI and rallying resources to the cause. What levers are on the table for the local county to encourage, incentivize, fund, or otherwise bring low-income housing to bear?
I mean, I'm not sure if I can speak too much to this, but there are a couple of, I think, options that were talked about in sort of around One Tacoma. We didn't get the chance to take action on them, but we did, recommend like the development of a community land trust, which would help to establish a certain set of homes that would be affordable permanently in the community. There's been some talk of creating some sort of social housing developer. But again, those are, I would say that those are more speculative. If Lauren has any other things to add of other methods that we could use, I'd be interested in hearing those.
My recommendation's dire. I actually think we're now at the point where we need a federal government like housing corps, like all hands on deck to start filling up the gap in basically every major city, and also all college town, all towns, all coastal communities, all vacation destinations, in order to start building a lot of housing in a very short amount of time. That is really truly the only answer I can reasonably think of that would help.
I mean, if you think about it, that's, I mean, if we know history, a lot of the big, large housing developments that they came as housing for military families. And now we use them as apartments, but that's how they got online fast. Salishan, like there's lots of them. New York, like, you know, these places, they were big housing developments that were made for military families that then, you know, once, you know, things shifted and GI Bill and people moved out of those and moved into houses. Yeah.
was just going to say a lot of the single family housing developments all throughout this country were also built post World War II to house veterans and their families. So it's been done a lot historically in this country, and I think it's frankly needed again.
Yeah, I think just the idea that privatization is going to fix everything is just, we've seen that that's a flawed concept. It doesn't actually work. So Korbett, do you know the state of the housing trust fund or housing financing, and how does that work, or how people are able to access those dollars?
I wouldn't feel comfortable speaking to that from my role, where there's interactions with the CRP and providers with the Housing Trust Fund and a number of different efforts, but I would only be able to speak to the CRP funded groups.
Okay. But you guys do have some resources for like people to get into housing though, or like that?
So there were the last set of releases that we did for grant awards were the last phase of the economic development dollars, and there was about 70 million that was put out. A good portion of that is down payment assistance. It can be stacked with the Covenant Homeownership Program. So the Covenant Homeownership Program is, you know, up to 20% down for individuals that their family or lived in Washington State during a period of time that there were restricted racial covenants. And so that trust fund, I believe, I'm seeing a lot of traffic in terms of people actually being able to use those dollars. Stacking it with CRP as well. There's grants up to, you know, what I've seen. There's a lot of funding that's out there for home ownership right now for CRP clients, and some really innovative ways to address what the needs are for people to purchase a home. Things like matched accounts for down payment assistance. So sometimes one of the barriers is that debt to income ratio. So there's certain programs to be able to match what they're putting down on their debt and take care of that before they go to escrow and those kinds of things, so they can have a better interest rate. So those programs are rolling out right now in a lot of those programs up and down the I-5 corridor.
Yeah. So there's lots of great questions, and I have 5 minutes, and I don't think I'm going to get through some of them, but I'm going to just throw out some ideas that are on the cards, and then you guys can respond to them. A tax structure that would, what would a tax structure look like? That is a per square foot or number of people living in the house versus number of rooms, so that there's incentivization to like match, you know, like what would something like that look like? There's also like this idea of, you know, we keep on looking, we're delaying, looking for this perfect solution. And what did it look like to bring something like SROs or different kinds of housing on board quickly that would allow people to have a place to stay? And then, you know, I think these three kind of go together. Like, how do we educate people, or how do people educate themselves so that they're making better decisions about the policies they're advocating for, the policies that we're like the kind of people we're voting in. Like, we sometimes show up for things, right? Like home in Tacoma, Chris, I'm sure you saw I don't know if you saw the first round of comments or the third round of comments. There were a lot of comments, and I understand people wanting to protect their house, their investment in their home. But there was also a lot of comments were like, yeah, that would be great if you do it over there. Don't do it over here. Like, don't do it by me, but go over there and do it. And how do we educate people to really understand that all of this is a continuum, that we're all affected by it. And even if you think you're good, you're probably not good permanently, because for the reasons that Lauren said, like, there's a big bill that's going to come to somebody for having, miles and miles of sidewalks. Like, I don't have any in Lakewood, so I won't be paying for them, but we have no sidewalks. But like, what are your thoughts about all of that? And Chris, if you want to start, you can.
I'll start. So that from that perspective, so being chair of the planning commission, trying to take a sort of a long range vision towards this, I think of what is life going to be like in 2050, in 2060, 2075. Climate change is going to be a significant driver. So I think our elected leaders need to really grapple with what that means and how that is likely to displace populations internally within the United States to areas like the Pacific Northwest that are going to be potentially, havens for climate refugees, literally. I guess that's the best way to describe it. But so to not people who balk at the fact that we're going to be growing by 130,000 people. That's the projection for 2045 for Tacoma. Those are the people who. They either need education or we need to be deferring to people who are recognizing that this is a fact and that this will be coming.
For sure.
I'll go before
Okay.
Lauren.
Okay. Well, hurry up. You have a minute.
Just quickly, that I think that there should be a little bit more technical assistance to kind of coordinate what resources are available in the state and how we're leveraging different programs and how they're stacked up with the intended groups. And I think we should get more buy-in for organizations at the table to be a part of that solution at the front end, and not think about the spark of development to just be programmatic, but systemic and thoughtful. And there need to be more resources to work with different governments across the state of which policies are really working to kind of advance certain things, and having some flexibility. So, and whatever Lauren says is probably.
All right, Lauren, you're going to take it home for us. So.
I would just say be suspicious of people and policies that blame other people, that encourage you to look inside only your four walls instead of your larger community. I would say be suspicious of policies that are not future forward and that people can't explain how you pay for them. Be suspicious of people and policies that don't try to find cost, Kyla, for things that aren't necessarily easily quantifiable, because some of those things are the things that affect your quality of life, right? And I would also say, I think part of the problem that we're facing, and I think you were just talking about it, is we have to care about other people. Like, that's the net. Either we choose to care about other people and it'll encourage people to have the political will to solve these big existential problems, or we're going to fail and I don't know what's going to happen to us.
Well, I knew this time was going to go really fast, and I knew we weren't going to get to all the questions, and I apologize. I tried my best. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate just having these dialogues. We'll be around for a few minutes after, so if you had one of these questions I didn't get to, you want to come up and talk to us, do that, and hopefully we'll see you next month. And with that, I'll turn it back to Laura.
Okay, let's give a big round of applause for our panelists. These conversations are always so good, and I'm so grateful to all of you for being part of this, and for everyone who came and attended today in person and virtual. I want to let everyone know that next week, February 5th, the City of Tacoma's comprehensive plan, including the transportation mobility plan, that will be available for public review next week. So get ready. Be hyped to read a big government document. And Downtown on the Go will try to consolidate some of the information around transportation for folks as well. I want to invite you all to join us for our next forum on February 28th, same time, same place. This will be on aging in place, access, and displacement. We'll have a recording of this forum available if you want to share it out. You'll get an email about that later on today. And yeah, just again, thank you all so much for coming and attending and engaging with these conversations. We'll be around for a little bit if you want to chat, and we appreciate you all. Have a great day.